everybody, my name is Markiplier and welcome to Five Nights at Freddy's in
Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier and welcome back to another Try Not to Laugh challenge. Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier and welcome to completing the mission. Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier and welcome to Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy. Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier and welcome back to Job Simulator. We're gonna go with the store clerk.
On March 9th, 2022, a game called Iron Lung was released on Steam. A game that was different from most out there, a game that successfully managed to create an entire universe, leaving people guessing, despite the lack of context and lack of what would be considered in-depth gameplay. A game that was simple yet effective, an indie game that drowned the world in an ocean of blood. Decades ago, every known star and habitable planet vanished, leaving only those who were on space stations or starships. This event became known as the Quiet Rapture. With supplies dwindling and infrastructure crumbling, survivors are searching for any trace of natural resources in a universe of barren moons. Lit by the ghost light of vanished stars, one such moon holds a strange anomaly: an ocean of blood. You are a convict, tasked with exploring this anomaly in a makeshift submarine nicknamed the Iron Lung. It was not designed for this depth, so you will be welded inside and the forward window will be closed. There was no time for training. If successful, you earn your freedom. You play as an unnamed convict who has been given an opportunity to earn their freedom by participating in an expedition into one of these blood oceans. Your destination is AT-5, a desolate moon covered by an enormous ocean of blood. Your vehicle is the SM-13, a tiny submarine that has been nicknamed the Iron Lung. And calling it a submarine is being generous. The Iron Lung is an old, rusted machine that has essentially been thrown together from whatever materials humanity has left. Because of the extreme pressure beneath the blood ocean, its windows have been sealed shut and the main hatch has been welded closed. There is no way for you to simply look outside. Instead, the only way to see your surroundings is through a small external camera mounted to the front of the submarine. Even then, you don't get a proper view of the environment. The camera produces nothing more than grainy, low-resolution photographs. Your mission is simple. Follow an incomplete map through the ocean, reach several designated locations, take photographs of anything interesting, and return to the surface. You aren't given a weapon, you aren't given a detailed sonar system, you aren't given a way to properly see what is around you. All you have is a map, a few instruments, the camera, and the knowledge that something may be living in the blood surrounding you. You slowly navigate through the darkness, carefully entering coordinates and following the map while occasionally stopping to take photographs. At first, these photographs don't seem particularly important. You might find strange rocks, plants, bones, or formations that don't quite make sense. But the further you travel, the more unnatural your discoveries become. The environment begins to suggest that there isn't simply an ocean filled with blood. There is something locked down here with you. At one point, the player discovers what appears to be an enormous skeleton. Elsewhere, strange structures appear to resemble pieces of buildings or walls, despite there being no reason for anything like that to exist at the bottom of an alien ocean. The deeper you travel, the more the game begins to blur the line between what is natural, what is artificial, and what is alive. And then the game starts giving you glimpses of something much larger. The iron lung begins shaking, strange sounds can be heard through the submarine. Something appears in the distance but disappears when you try to photograph it again. Eventually, when investigating one of the points of interest, the player captures something that confirms their worst fears. An eye. A massive eye belonging to some enormous creature hidden within the blood ocean. The creature notices you. From this point forward, the feeling of the game changes. What initially felt like a dangerous scientific expedition becomes much more hopeless. The submarine begins to suffer damage, and the player has to continue navigating while knowing there is something moving through the water with them. The iron lung was never designed to fight whatever lives down there. It was barely designed to survive the journey in the first place. And yet, the mission continues. The player reaches the final points of interest and attempts to gather the remaining photographs, but before they can escape, the creature finally reaches the submarine. The iron lung is breached, and the player is killed. There is no heroic escape. There is no final confrontation. There isn't even a proper explanation of what the creature is. After the player's death, the game provides one final piece of information. The wreckage of the iron lung cannot currently be recovered, meaning the photographs and information gathered during the expedition are effectively lost. And that's where Iron Lung ends. But strangely, the game doesn't feel like it has actually ended. Because despite being less than an hour long, Iron Lung leaves behind an enormous amount of unanswered questions. What exactly was the quiet rapture? Why did every habitable planet and star disappear? Where did the blood oceans come from? Why is the blood human? What are the strange structures beneath the surface? What exactly is the creature living within the ocean? And perhaps most importantly, what does any of this mean for the rest of humanity? And the game never gives us those answers. Despite the constant questions surrounding the game and the growing attention it received online, one person would eventually take Iron Lung far beyond its original boundaries. A name known across almost every corner of the internet, and someone who had already spent years turning his passion for gaming into something much larger than YouTube. A man named Markiplier. Mark Fischbach, better known as Markiplier, began his YouTube career in 2012, and quickly became one of the biggest creators on the platform. Particularly through his horror and gaming content, games like Five Nights at Freddy's, Amnesia, and countless other indie horror titles helped establish him as one of gaming's most recognizable faces. But over the years, Markiplier's ambitions began to extend beyond simply playing games. In 2019, Markiplier released A Heist with Markiplier, and later began working on projects that pushed further into filmmaking. Eventually, with his passion clear to all of his loyal followers, the stage was set for an idea. Anything at all to inspire Mark to put his passion to bear fruit. What began as a short indie horror game about a convict trapped inside a submarine would eventually become something far more ambitious. In 2023, Markiplier announced that he was developing an Iron Lung movie, with himself serving as the writer, director, producer, and star. Rather than simply recreating the events of the game, the film would expand upon its world and explore ideas that the original game deliberately left unanswered. And that decision is what makes the movie so interesting. Because Iron Lung was never a story that gave us all the answers, its entire identity was built around mystery, ambiguity, and the fear of discovering something that we were never meant to understand. So how do you take a game that can be completed in under an hour with almost no traditional storytelling, and turn it into a feature-length film? How do you expand on a universe built almost entirely on unanswered questions without destroying the mystery that made it so compelling in the first place? That was the challenge Markiplier had in front of him. Nearly 4 years of work, only $3 million, a small team of Mark's most ambitious and creative friends, and a dream. Iron Lung had gone from a tiny horror game into a feature-length film.
Supplies dwindle. Infrastructure crumbles. Too few to rebuild. Too many to feed. Humanity decays. But don't despair, my sons. I tell you now that there is more to these moons than meets the eye. The consolidation. They hide their technology, their people. They won't tell you what they found, but I will. One moon stands apart from the rest. And in the darkness of that moon, an ocean of blood.
But restricted perspective, single location, single character stories are incredibly hard to pull off. And this ain't all is lost, lock, or buried. While Fishbach's performance is solid, it isn't sufficiently magnetic to hold the required retention. His script lacks the sparkle to keep us engaged, relying on non-zingers like "this is bigger than any one of us." His visual tricks, close-up of droplets, close-up of eyes, letting images go out of focus, presumably deliberately, quickly grows stale while the final scenes descend into indiscernible visual anarchy. And the pacing throughout is so lead-in and monotonous, the effect is frankly soporific. Essentially, Iron Lung is an interesting little concept smeared too thin across a far too long running time. It could have been a cool short, instead it is a patience tester that's hard to recommend to anyone outside of the Markiplier faithful. There just isn't enough meat to flesh out 2 hours of runtime. There is enough visually to respect what Markiplier is able to accomplish. Unfortunately, this movie fails to build its story properly, struggles to maintain momentum, and ultimately feels a bit too repetitive. Despite Fishbach's arguably admirable intent and exoration, this low-budget sci-fi horror makes Event Horizon look like 2001: A Space Odyssey. The only sense of dread I felt was how much was left on the bloated running time. Iron Lung had gone from a tiny indie horror game made by one developer to a feature-length film playing on thousands of movie screens. And somehow that wasn't enough for everyone, because when Iron Lung finally released, the response from critics was complicated. Not disastrous, but certainly nowhere near the response you might expect after hearing the story behind its creation. At the time of writing, Iron Lung sits at 59% on Rotten Tomatoes from critics, compared to the 86% verified audience score. IMDb's user rating sits around 5.8 out of 10. And when you actually read through the negative reviews, one complaint appears again and again and again. The movie is too long. Critics argued that there simply wasn't enough material here to justify a runtime of over 2 hours. John Odette, a pop culture leftovers, described the movie as something that stretches itself too thin, criticizing the repetitive shots and bloated pacing. Decider complained that there were only so many possible camera angles inside the submarine before the movie began repeating them. Other critics made similar arguments, suggesting that a game which can be completed in less than an hour simply did not contain enough material to support a feature-length film. And this is where I think we need to do something that the internet is becoming increasingly bad at doing. We need to admit that those criticisms are fair, because they are. There are stretches of Iron Lung where very little happens. There are moments where Simon simply sits there. There are moments where he walks across the same cramped room we have already seen dozens of times. There are shots of condensation, metal, pipes, gauges, blood, sweat, the same walls, the same controls, the same narrow corridor. And after 2 hours, you are extremely familiar with every inch of the Iron Lung itself. You know where Simon sits, you know where the controls are, you know where the camera is, you know where the pipes run. And you know the sounds the submarine makes. You know what a normal creak sounds like, and eventually you start noticing when one of those sounds isn't normal. That distinction is incredibly important. Because I don't think Iron Lung is slow by accident. I believe Iron Lung wants you to become exhausted by that submarine. It wants you to become familiar with it. It wants you to hate it. It wants you to feel trapped inside of it. And that is why something that many critics interpreted as one of the movie's greatest weaknesses may actually be one of the most important choices Markiplier made. The repetition is the point. Think about the actual situation Simon is in. He isn't exploring a haunted mansion where every room gives the filmmaker a new visual environment. He isn't running through a spaceship filled with monsters. He isn't traveling between different planets. He is welded inside a metal coffin. There is nowhere else to go. There is no second location waiting for him. There is no beautiful landscape outside the window because there isn't even a window. There is no escape from the environment. And if Mark had constantly found excuses to move Simon into exciting new rooms, introduce new locations, or dramatically change the visual language of the movie every 10 minutes, he would have undermined the entire premise. The Iron Lung is supposed to feel small. It is supposed to feel repetitive. It is supposed to feel oppressive. Simon wakes up surrounded by the same walls. He works surrounded by the same walls. He drinks water surrounded by the same walls. He panics surrounded by the same walls. And if everything goes according to plan, he will still be surrounded by those walls when the mission ends. The audience is imprisoned with him. So yes, the camera angles repeat, but of course they repeat. Where else is the camera supposed to go? That limitation becomes part of the storytelling. At the beginning of the movie, the submarine almost feels manageable. It's uncomfortable but understandable. We can mentally map the room, we understand where Simon is, we understand where his equipment is. And because the movie spends so much time establishing that environment, something strange begins to happen. The submarine stops feeling like a movie set, it starts feeling like a place, and once that happens, Mark can begin corrupting it. The lighting, the sound, the temperature, it all starts changing. Moisture begins covering surfaces, Simon becomes increasingly exhausted, the machinery becomes less trustworthy. The walls begin feeling closer. The same room we became comfortable understanding slowly becomes hostile. And suddenly those repetitive angles aren't simply showing us the same thing, they are showing us the same thing becoming worse. That is a completely different experience. If the camera was constantly moving somewhere new, we wouldn't have that baseline. We wouldn't know what normal looked like. But because Mark forces us to spend so much time inside this environment, tiny changes become enormous. A strange noise matters, a blinking instrument matters, a pipe leaking matters. Something moving where nothing was moving before matters. Because when you've spent an hour listening to the iron lung breathe around you, the absence of that sound can become just as terrifying as the presence of something else. And this is where the runtime becomes much easier to understand. A lot of horror movies work by constantly giving the audience something to react to. A jump scare, a monster, a chase sequence, a death, a reveal, then another jump scare, another monster, another chase. Iron Lung doesn't really work like that. The horror isn't primarily coming from what Simon sees, the horror comes from what Simon cannot see. There is an entire ocean surrounding him and almost all of it is invisible. That is the central concept of the original game, and Mark understood something incredibly important about adapting it. The moment you show too much, the fear disappears. In the game, the player doesn't receive a live camera feed, you receive photographs, simple images, tiny glimpses of something enormous. You move through complete darkness, stop the submarine, take a picture, and wait. For a brief moment, you see what is outside, then it's gone again. That mechanic works because your imagination is also doing all of the work for you. And the movie attempts to recreate that feeling through pacing. It makes you wait, it makes you listen. It makes you stare at Simon staring at something you cannot see. It makes you wonder whether the noise came from the submarine, or from something outside of it. And most importantly, it gives your imagination time to become your enemy. When something actually does happen, the fear isn't created entirely by that moment. It is created by the 30 minutes you spend expecting that moment to happen. Every metallic groan becomes suspicious, every pressure change becomes threatening, every malfunction raises the same question. Was that the submarine failing, or did something attack us? And over all of that hangs one of the simplest threats imaginable: oxygen. Simon does not need to encounter a monster to die, the iron lung itself can kill him. The pressure can kill him, the heat can kill him, the machinery can kill him. His oxygen can run out, the hull can fail, he can become lost, he can reach the wrong coordinates. And none of those possibilities require some giant cinematic action sequence. The environment itself is the threat. One critic even acknowledged that the movie's strongest moments come when the dwindling oxygen, rising heat, and condensation make the submarine increasingly unbearable. And that is why the slow pacing works for me. Because this isn't a movie about escaping danger, it's a movie about realizing that there may not be an escape at all. There is something almost cruel about how long Mark makes us stay inside that submarine. Every extra minute becomes another minute Simon has to survive. Another minute consuming oxygen, another minute moving deeper. Another minute where something could be following him. The runtime itself becomes part of the pressure. You begin wanting Simon to reach the next location faster. You want him to finish the mission. You want something to happen. Anything at all. And when you come to realize this, you notice that Simon wants exactly the same thing. That impatience the audience feels becomes strangely connected to the character. We are tired of being here. So is he. We want out. So does he. But neither of us gets to leave. And that is where I think the conversation surrounding the film becomes interesting. Because describing a movie as slow isn't necessarily the same thing as describing it as badly paced. Sometimes slowness is a mistake, sometimes a movie really does need 30 minutes removed. And if someone watches Iron Lung and genuinely feels that the repetition destroys the tension rather than building it, I completely understand that criticism. This is not going to work for everyone. But there is a difference between saying, the movie's pacing didn't work for me, and saying the movie has no reason to be this slow. Because I think there is a reason. You are supposed to live in that discomfort, and this is exactly why the response to Iron Lung became so divided. Critics landed at 59%, verified audiences were significantly more positive. Rotten Tomatoes' own audience summary describes the movie as a slow psychological descent whose mood and atmosphere leaves an impact. That doesn't mean audiences are automatically correct and critics are automatically wrong. But it does tell us something. The very qualities that frustrated some critics were the qualities that other viewers connected with the most. The claustrophobia, the atmosphere, the ambiguity, the slow burn, the refusal to constantly explain itself. And honestly, that feels incredibly appropriate for an adaptation of Iron Lung. Because if there was one thing Mark absolutely could not do, it was turn this into a conventional Hollywood horror movie. That would be the safest decision. Give Simon a huge backstory, explain the quiet rapture, explain the blood ocean, explain the creature. Give the monster a name, give humanity a solution, give Simon a heroic arc. Add a few supporting characters, show the exterior of the submarine constantly, have the creature chase him for 40 minutes. Give the audience a big final battle, then tease a sequel. That version of Iron Lung probably would have been easier to the market. It probably would have been easier to review. And it would have completely missed the point. The original game is terrifying because it doesn't care whether you understand it. It gives you pieces, not answers. And one of Mark's greatest accomplishments is that he expanded the world without completely solving it. That is much harder than it actually sounds. When adapting a game this small, there are really two ways you can fail. You can remain too faithful and essentially recreate a 45-minute experience stretched across 2 hours. Or you can expand everything so dramatically that the adaptation no longer feels like the original story. Mark somehow tries to walk directly between these two extremes. He gives the world more texture, he gives the mission more context, he gives Simon more humanity. He allows us to experience more of the consequences of the quiet rapture, he gives us more glimpses into the surviving humanity. But he refuses to answer the largest questions, and that restriction matters. Because The Quiet Rapture should not become less terrifying after the movie. It should become more terrifying. We still don't completely understand what happened, we still don't completely understand why these oceans exist. We still don't understand what is living inside of them. We don't even completely understand whether what Simon is seeing is biological, supernatural, cosmic, or psychological. And somehow, all of them at once. And that is exactly how it should be. Mark didn't inherit a story with hundreds of characters and novels worth of lore. He inherited a feeling. Isolation, confusion, helplessness, curiosity, dread. And his job was to turn that feeling into 2 hours of cinema. That is a completely different challenge from simply adapting a plot. And he did all of this with around $3 million. $3 million. For perspective, that is not a lot of money in modern filmmaking, not even remotely. And yet the movie needed to create an entire science fiction universe while spending most of its runtime inside a tiny metal submarine. That limitation could have killed the movie. Instead, Mark turned it into the movie's identity. The set doesn't need to look like $1 billion spacecraft, it shouldn't. The Iron Lung is supposed to look terrible, dreadful, humanity is dying. Infrastructure is collapsing, resources are disappearing. The submarine was assembled because people are desperate enough to weld a prisoner inside a machine and throw him beneath an ocean of blood. The rust matters, the ugly machinery matters, the improvised equipment matters. The submarine looking like it could fall apart at any moment isn't a production flaw, it's world building. Every exposed pipe tells us something about humanity's situation. Every damaged surface tells us that the civilization isn't advancing anymore. It's cannibalizing what remains. That isn't the future humanity dreamed about. This is humanity surviving inside the corpse of that future. And because the film understands that, its budget almost becomes an advantage. Iron Lung doesn't need endless digital environments. It doesn't need massive fleets of spaceships. It doesn't need enormous cities. It doesn't need $100 million creatures appearing every 10 minutes. It only needs you to believe that there is something beyond those walls, something huge, something ancient. Something that Simon should never have found. And the less we see, the larger that thing becomes inside our imagination. That is the brilliance of Iron Lung as source material. And it is where Mark's interpretation becomes something more than a YouTuber recreating a game he fell in love with. He understands the language of the original, maybe not perfectly, maybe not in a way that every critic appreciated. But he understood what made the original horrifying. And then he translated it. And the result was something genuinely unusual, a 2-hour experimental science fiction horror film. Mostly set in one room based on a tiny indie video game. Written, directed, and starring one of the biggest YouTubers in the world, self-distributed through Markiplier Studios. Rated R, released in theaters. And somehow, it worked wonders. Financially, it worked on a level almost nobody could have reasonably expected. The film reportedly cost around $3 million to produce. Its worldwide theatrical gross eventually reached approximately $51.2 million. More than 41 million of that came from the domestic box office alone. That means the film grossed more than 17 times its reported production budget at the worldwide box office. Now, obviously, box office gross is not the same thing as profit. Theaters keep a percentage, marketing costs money, distribution costs money. There are expenses that are not included in the production budget. But none of that changes the scale of what happened. A $3 million independently produced horror movie made more than $50 million in theaters. That is extraordinary. Its opening weekend alone brought in roughly 18 million domestically. It opened across more than 3,000 theaters. And at one point, it was competing near the top of the box office against movies backed by companies with resources that Mark simply did not have. And suddenly, the conversation around Iron Lung became bigger than whether or not the movie was good. Because Mark had accidentally demonstrated something. Maybe the traditional path wasn't the only path anymore. For decades, the assumption had been relatively simple. If you want to make a movie at this scale, eventually you need the system. You need a major distributor. You need studio executives. You need marketing departments. You need someone deciding whether your project even deserves to reach an audience. And Mark looked at that system and essentially asked, what if I already have that audience? That doesn't mean everyone can repeat what he did. Markiplier has spent more than a decade building one of the largest audiences on the internet. That is an enormous advantage. And pretending his popularity had nothing to do with the movie's success would be ridiculous. Of course it mattered. Millions of people knew who he was. Millions of people wanted to support him. Millions of people had followed the production for years, me included. His name created awareness that most independent filmmakers would spend millions of dollars trying to purchase through advertising. And there is something critics of the movie's success sometimes miss. Popularity can convince someone to buy a ticket. It cannot control what happens after they sit down. It cannot force someone to enjoy 2 hours locked inside a metal box. It cannot force audiences to recommend the movie. It cannot manufacture genuine attachment to the atmosphere, visuals, sound design, and the world itself. And it certainly cannot guarantee that an experimental, slow-burning, R-rated adaptation of a niche indie horror game becomes a $50 million theatrical release. If subscriber count automatically created successful movies, every major influencer would have a box office franchise. They don't. Because an audience is not the same thing as trust. And trust is not the same thing as artistic success. Mark's popularity opened the door, Iron Lung walked through it. And perhaps the clearest evidence of that is the gap between the critical reception and the audience reception. This wasn't a movie receiving universal praise. Critics were openly telling people that it was too slow. Too repetitive, too long, too vague. Some of them essentially argued that the concept should have remained in the game. And people still went. More importantly, many of them came out liking what they saw. Rotten Tomatoes currently has the critic score at 59%, while its verified audience score sits at 86%. That difference is fascinating, because it suggests that the film connected directly with the kind of audience it was made for. And maybe that's a larger lesson here. Not every movie needs to appeal to everybody. That sounds obvious, but modern filmmaking frequently behaves as if the opposite is true. Movies are tested, adjusted, simplified, expanded, explained, rewritten. Designed to offend a few audience expectations as possible. Because hundreds of millions of dollars may be sitting on the line. Iron Lung didn't have that problem. It couldn't afford to. Mark wasn't making a movie that needed to become a franchise. He was making Iron Lung. And because the budget was relatively small and the production remained independent, the movie was allowed to be strange. It was allowed to be slow. It was allowed to be uncomfortable. It was allowed to confuse people. And most importantly, it was allowed to fail. That freedom may be one of the most important reasons it succeeded. Because audiences can feel when something was made because someone desperately wanted it to exist. There is a difference between content manufactured to occupy a release date and a project someone has spent years trying to drag into reality. Iron Lung feels handmade. Sometimes that makes it feel rough. Sometimes that makes it frustrating. Sometimes you can practically see Mark trying to solve a filmmaking problem in real time. But that imperfection gives the movie personality. And personality is becoming increasingly valuable in an industry filled with technically immaculate movies that audiences forget 2 weeks later. You can criticize Iron Lung. You should criticize Iron Lung. Mark is a first-time featured director. There are scenes that could be tighter. There are moments where the dialogue doesn't completely land. There are stretches where the movie's commitment to atmosphere pushes dangerously close to monotony. There are moments where the disorientating visuals may push some viewers out of the experience rather than pulling them deeper into it. Those are legitimate criticisms, but flaws do not erase accomplishment, and they certainly don't erase intention. A movie can be imperfect and still be important or impactful. In fact, sometimes those are the most interesting movies, because perfection is rarely where new filmmakers begin. They begin by attempting something they probably shouldn't be able to pull off. And sometimes they fail, sometimes they succeed, and occasionally they do both at the same time. That is Iron Lung. It is messy. It is ambitious, it is suffocating, it is repetitive, it is strange, it is occasionally frustrating. And it is unmistakably somebody's movie. Not a committee's, not an algorithm's, not a studio attempting to imitate whatever made money last year. It is Markiplier's movie. And that may ultimately be more important than the Rotten Tomatoes score. Because the real legacy of Iron Lung may not be whether critics eventually reconsider it. The real legacy may be the people watching what Mark did and realizing they can try something similar. A YouTuber doesn't need to become a studio director before making a movie. An independent filmmaker doesn't necessarily need to wait for permission for Hollywood before finding an audience. A creator who has spent years building a community might already possess something major studios spend enormous amounts of money trying to create. A direct relationship with viewers. And Mark proved that relationship can move beyond a computer screen. It can fill theaters. According to industry reporting, Iron Lung was initially expected to have a much smaller theatrical footprint before grassroots demand helped turn the release into something far larger, eventually reaching more than 3,000 screens. Think about how insane that is. This wasn't Marvel, Warner Brothers, Universal, Disney. This was a guy who started uploading gaming videos to YouTube in 2012. A developer who released a tiny horror game on Steam, a relatively small production team, a rusted submarine, an ocean of blood, and an audience willing to follow them there. That is why I think saying Iron Lung's success is all because Markiplier is famous misses the most interesting part of the story. Yes, Markiplier's fame mattered, obviously, but fame gave him an opportunity. What he did with that opportunity is what matters. He could have made something safe. He could have attached his name to a generic horror movie. He could have used his audience as guaranteed customers and produced the easiest possible product. Instead, he spent years making a bleak, slow, claustrophobic science fiction horror film based on a niche game where the protagonist spends most of the experience looking at coordinates inside a metal box. That is not the decision of someone trying to exploit an audience. That is the decision of someone trusting his own followers. He trusted that viewers would sit through silence. He trusted that they wouldn't need every question answered. He trusted that atmosphere could carry scenes without constant dialogue. He trusted that a monster didn't need to be visible every 5 minutes to remain terrifying. He trusted that people would understand why the submarine had to feel repetitive, and apparently, enough people did. More than $51 million worth of tickets later, Iron Lung isn't simply a successful YouTuber movie. It is a successful independent movie, and that distinction matters. Because the next person who tries something like this won't necessarily have to convince theaters that the idea is impossible. Mark already proved it isn't. The next creator who wants to finance their own film has another example to point towards. The next independent director wondering whether an unconventional audience can support an unconventional movie has another case study. The next filmmaker sitting in their bedroom with an idea that sounds completely ridiculous can look at this and realize something. Ridiculous does not mean impossible. That doesn't mean every creator with 10 million subscribers suddenly becomes a filmmaker. It doesn't mean Hollywood disappears. It doesn't mean distribution companies no longer matter. And it certainly doesn't mean Iron Lung reinvented cinema. But it moved the line, even slightly, and sometimes that is how industries change. Not because somebody destroys the old system overnight, but because somebody demonstrates that another route exists. A route that wasn't supposed to work until it did. And that brings us back to those reviews. Too long, too repetitive, not enough story, not enough camera angles, not enough material. Maybe. But perhaps the better question is, what was the movie trying to make you feel? Because if the goal was to make you comfortable, then yes, Iron Lung failed. If the goal was to constantly entertain you with new locations and new characters, it failed. If the goal was to neatly explain its universe, it failed. If the goal was to give you a conventional horror movie, it failed. But if the goal was to trap you inside a dying machine, to make 2 hours feel exhausting, to make you desperate to see something outside, to make every sound beyond the hole feel like a threat, to make you question what is real, to make you feel the weight of being completely alone beneath an impossible ocean, then maybe the things people hated about Iron Lung were exactly the things making it work. The submarine isn't boring because Mark forgot to give us somewhere to go. There is nowhere else to go. The camera itself isn't repeating because Mark ran out of ideas. Simon is trapped. The audience is trapped. The story is trapped. And when the movie finally begins ripping that familiar environment apart, when the safety of those repetitive walls disappears, when all of that waiting finally explodes into violence and confusion, it matters because we spent so much time believing those walls were the only thing keeping Simon alive. The Iron Lung was his prison, and eventually it became his shelter. Until it couldn't protect him anymore. That is why the movie stayed with me. Not because it's perfect. It isn't. Not because every critic misunderstood it. They didn't. And not because Markiplier should somehow be immune from criticism simply because making the movie was difficult. He shouldn't. Criticism matters, but criticism is also interpretation. And sometimes the difference between a flaw and a feature is what the filmmaker was trying to accomplish. Some people watched Iron Lung and saw 2 hours stretched out from a 45-minute game. I saw 45-minute gameplay expanded into an experience that forces you to remain inside its nightmare. Some people saw repeated camera angles. I saw a room slowly turning into a coffin. Some people saw nothing happening. I saw a man listening to the walls around him and wondering which sound would be his last. And maybe that is the fundamental disagreement surrounding this movie. Iron Lung doesn't always entertain you. Sometimes it simply makes you stay. Stay in the submarine, in the silence, in the dark. Stay long enough that you begin wishing something would happen. And then when something does, the game was about being afraid of what existed outside. The movie understood that the greater horror might be realizing there is nowhere inside the submarine that is truly safe either. And somehow, with $3 million and a project almost nobody in Hollywood would have made this way, Mark Fishbach pulled it off. A YouTuber walked into filmmaking with an adaptation of a tiny horror game. Critics questioned the pacing, the runtime, whether there was enough material for a movie at all. Audience showed up anyway. The film grossed around more than $51 million worldwide. And now the question isn't whether Markiplier can make a movie. He already did. The question is what happens when the next person realizes they can too. Because maybe the most important thing Mark found beneath that ocean of blood wasn't a monster. It wasn't an explanation for the quiet rapture. It wasn't whatever humanity was searching for on AT5. It was proof. Proof that a strange idea can survive without being sanded down into something familiar. Proof that independent creators can take enormous creative risks and still find an audience. Proof that limitations don't always have to be hidden. Sometimes you can build the entire movie around them. And proof that the people standing outside the traditional film industry don't always have to wait for someone inside to invite them in. Sometimes you can build the submarine yourself. You can weld the door shut. Point it towards the darkness and dive in. Not knowing what you're going to find. Not knowing whether you're going to make it back. But knowing that somebody has to be the first one willing to go down there. And for better or for worse, Markiplier went first.